Snow fell heavy that winter evening, blanketing the wooden roofs of the small frontier town in silence. Yet nothing could hush the sound of whispers running down the narrow street. Folks gathered in their wool coats and worn hats, boots sinking deep in the frost, as though drawn by some invisible force. It wasn't every day a man like him walked into their midst. The giant Apache stood taller than any horse hitched along the posts, his shoulders broad as the beams that held the saloon upright, his hair long and silver against the dark skin of his weathered face. Some said he was too big for this world, a man born out of proportion, cursed to be sold like cattle because no family or town could claim him without fear. Yet that night, under the lantern light and falling snow, he was no man's property. He was strength itself, and in his arms lay a girl who had been cast aside for her own size. The crowd's breath froze in the air, not from cold alone, but from disbelief. Only hours earlier, she had been spoken for on the auction block, bartered like a mule. Her height had marked her as undesirable, her broad frame mocked, until no bidder would meet the price. The auctioneer's voice had faltered, shame seeping into the crowd. And for a moment it seemed she would be left standing there forever, unsold and unwanted. Then the ground had seemed to tremble as the Apache stepped forward, his boots thudding against the wooden planks. He said no word, just lifted her in his arms, as though she were light as a feather, and looked at the townsfolk with eyes that dared them to speak. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking who he was, while the old men muttered that he had come from the mountains, from a place where the snow touched heaven. Stories had followed him long before his feet did, stories of a warrior too great for battle, of chains that could not hold him, of camps that whispered his name with awe and fear. They said he had been traded more times than a prize stallion, sold for his strength, for his size, for the sheer spectacle of him. But no master had ever kept him long, for his spirit was not meant to be caged. Now here he was, holding a girl the world had called too much. And in his low, thunder-like voice, he had spoken words that cut through the night. "You're perfect for my arms." Gasps rose from the crowd. It wasn't only what he said, it was the way he said it, as if he meant every syllable. For a moment, the girl buried her face against his chest, her tears vanishing into the beads and leather that crossed his bare skin. She had been mocked for years, her sighs turned into shame, and yet in that instant, she was seen differently, not as a burden, but as belonging. The people shuffled uneasily, their judgment hanging in the cold air. Some in the crowd clenched their fists. They whispered that such unions were unnatural, that the giant Apache had no right to claim her. Yet no one dared step forward. The sheriff's hand hovered at his sidearm, but his eyes betrayed hesitation. Even the law knew better than to provoke a man whose shadow stretched larger than the gallows itself. Women in bonnets craned their necks, torn between pity and awe, while the men muttered about pride and the humiliation of seeing one of their own carried off like a treasure by an outsider. The Apache didn't flinch under their stares. He stood as the snow swirled harder, as if the heavens themselves wished to cloak him in mystery. The girl in his arms trembled, not from cold, but from the unknown path now unfolding. She remembered the laughter that had followed her steps since childhood, the way doors closed when she entered a room, the way boys chose others smaller, softer. She remembered how her father had lowered his eyes when no suitor came, how her mother had prayed she might shrink with age. None of those memories mattered now. The only truth that seemed to exist was the strength of the arms that held her, and the voice that had told her she was not too much, but just enough. The hush in the street deepened. Every heart seemed to pound in rhythm with the giant's footsteps as he began to move, carrying her past the frozen gazes of the crowd. No one knew where he would take her, or what fate awaited her beyond the edge of town. Some feared he would vanish into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Others whispered that he would bring war upon them, that his claim of her was a challenge to their way of life. The lanterns swayed overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the snow, as if mocking the indecision of those too small to intervene. The girl lifted her head at last. Her eyes searched the faces in the crowd, looking for one shred of kindness, one person to tell her this wasn't madness. But all she saw was envy, disapproval, and fear. And then she looked back at the man who carried her, his jaw set, his eyes forward, and something inside her shifted. For the first time, she did not feel like a misfit piece of the world. She felt chosen, yet questions swirled like the snow around them. Why had he come here, of all places, on this very night? What did he intend to do with her? A girl marked by rejection? Was he driven by compassion, or by some secret purpose only he knew? The crowd would never forget the sight of that towering figure. The girl cradled against him like a bride, nor the words that rolled like thunder through the winter silence. The town would talk for years about that night, about how the giant Apache defied them all with a single gesture. But for her, the moment was not yet a legend. It was real, raw, and terrifying. The snow kept falling, the crowd kept staring, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the giant carried her toward the unknown. And just as they reached the end of the street, where the lamplight gave way to darkness, a voice rang out from the crowd, sharp, angry, and trembling with something more than fear. The giant paused mid-step, the girl clutching tighter to him, and the silence broke like glass. What was said, no one could mistake, and what came next would decide everything. Would the town let them go? Or would the weight of suspicion and envy spark something that neither size nor strength could protect against? The answer hung in the night air, unfinished. As the snow fell heavier still, the voice that cut through the falling snow belonged to a man known by everyone in town. He was one of the wealthier traders. A man who prided himself on knowing the price of every horse, every acre, and every person that stood on the auction block. His words came out sharp and bitter, accusing the giant Apache of stealing what was not his. The sound carried across the silent crowd, echoing against the wooden fronts of the saloon and the general store, and in that moment all eyes shifted once again. Some looked with relief that someone had spoken, others with dread, for they knew such words could not be taken back. The giant froze mid-step, his grip on the girl steady as stone, his gaze not even shifting toward the man who had shouted. He simply stood still, snow gathering on his broad shoulders, as though waiting to see if anyone else dared rise against him. The girl's heart pounded against his chest. Every instinct told her that trouble was about to break loose, that this moment could turn violent. Yet the giant said nothing. His silence seemed more powerful than anger, more dangerous than any weapon. The trader tried again, louder this time, shouting that the girl was not his to claim. He accused him of defiance, of insult, of trespass. But beneath the bluster, there was something else, something trembling. Fear. The people shifted uneasily, their boots scraping against the frozen ground. The sheriff's hand once more brushed the handle of his gun, though his knuckles were pale and his eyes narrowed in calculation. No one wanted to be the first to step forward, because deep down they all remembered the stories. They remembered the whispers of what the giant Apache had done in other places, how he had survived chains, whips, and betrayals. I had torn through the bonds meant to keep him. He was not a man to be tested. The giant finally moved, his breath visible in the cold, slow, and heavy. His eyes fixed on the trader, unblinking, and for a brief moment the man's voice faltered. Then, in that same low, rumbling tone that had silenced the crowd before, the Apache spoke only one word: enough. It was not shouted. It was not angry. But it rolled through the air with finality, as though the very earth obeyed it. The trader lowered his gaze, swallowed hard, and no more words came. The giant then turned his head back forward, his arms firm around the girl, stepped into the dark beyond the lamplight. The crowd did not follow. They simply watched, snow piling on their hats and coats, as the shadows swallowed the towering figure and the girl he carried. Only after the sound of his heavy steps faded into the distance did the murmurs rise again, full of speculation, warnings, and quiet awe. Some swore he would take her to the mountains. Others whispered he would use her to send a message, to remind the townsfolk that there were powers they could not control. None dared voice what some truly feared, that she had not been taken against her will, but chosen, out beyond the last house of the town. Where the lantern light no longer reached, the girl finally found her voice. Her words came out weak and shaking, asking him why. Why had he come for her? Why had he chosen her, when so many others had laughed and turned away? His answer was slow, spoken as if each word carried weight. He told her that strength knew its own, that she was not too much, not too tall, not too wide, but exactly as she was meant to be. He said that in his eyes she was not a burden, but a match, one whose spirit had been hidden under the shame others had cast upon her. The words sank into her chest, like warmth against the bitter cold. For years she had believed the lies of others, had carried them like stones on her back. Yet this man, this stranger, had seen something different. Still, her fear lingered. She asked where he was taking her, and he only answered that the night would tell, and that the journey was not hers alone, but theirs together. The mystery deepened in her heart. Back in the town, the sheriff called a small gathering inside the saloon. The stove burned hot, melting the snow off coats, filling the air with steam and tension. The traitor who had shouted stood at the center, red-faced and fuming, demanding that something be done. He claimed the girl had been stolen, that it was the duty of law and men to bring her back. But the sheriff leaned back in his chair, eyes on the smoke curling from his pipe, and asked the room if anyone wished to face the giant Apache themselves. Silence answered him. No one was eager to chase into the snow after a man whose legend was already larger than life. Still, doubts began to stir. Some argued that letting the Apache walk away would show weakness. Others whispered that perhaps the girl had wanted to leave, though none dared say it too loudly. In that quiet, a fear began to grow that the stranger's presence meant more than just one girl's fate. If he could walk into their town and take without permission, what else could follow? The seeds of conflict were planted, though no one yet knew how they would grow. Meanwhile, the giant carried her farther, into the wilderness where the wind howled through bare trees and the snow crunched beneath his boots. Hours seemed to stretch into days. At last, when she thought she could no longer bear the suspense, he stopped in a clearing. He set her gently on her feet, and for the first time she stood before him, able to look up fully into his face. The moonlight revealed scars across his chest and arms, marks of battles fought long before. His eyes, dark and steady, held something that was neither cruelty nor pity, but certainty. He told her stories then, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. Stories of being sold as a child for his size, of being forced into labor camps where men wagered whether he could be broken. Stories of escape, of freedom, of wandering from town to town, never belonging. He spoke of how each place tried to use him until he became more myth than man. Yet in all his journeys, he had never seen anyone stand as she had tall in her own way, marked by rejection, but not destroyed by it. He told her that when he saw her on that auction block, he recognized the weight she carried because he had carried it too. Her breath caught as she listened. Every word painted him less as a monster and more as a mirror of her own loneliness. For the first time, she wondered if her fate was not to shrink herself into acceptance, but to grow into the space she had been given. Still, uncertainty gnawed at her. She asked again where he meant to take her, and again he gave no clear answer, only promising that the path ahead was not one of shame but of choice. As the fire they built flickered against the snow, she felt the weight of the night pressing in. Back in town, men and women argued over her absence. Some would ride out at dawn, not to save her, but to protect their pride. Others would whisper prayers that she might find something better than the narrow lives they had carved for themselves. And in the dark between the two worlds, she stood on the edge of something she could not yet name. The giant sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the flames, his silence heavy with secrets. She could not tell if he was protector, savior, or stranger. But she knew one thing for certain: the moment he lifted her in his arms, her life had changed. The cold wind carried the sound of distant wolves. The forest watched with 1,000 unseen eyes, and the night held them in its grasp, waiting to see what choice would be made when the sun rose, and as the firelight flickered across his scars, and the snow whispered against the earth. The girl wondered if she had been carried away to safety or into the very heart of danger itself. The answer was not yet clear, and the path ahead lay hidden. Waiting in silence, the fire burned low, its glow fighting against the biting cold of the wilderness. When the girl finally realized how quiet the night had become, not the quiet of peace, but the kind that carried weight, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, She glanced toward the giant Apache, who sat across from her with his hands resting on his knees, his face unreadable in the shadows. His silence was unsettling, yet somehow it steadied her too. She could not explain it. What frightened her more was not knowing what waited beyond this night. He had taken her from the jeers and shame of the auction block, yet what he offered was no promise of safety. Instead, it was mystery. Her thoughts wandered back to town, to the faces twisted in judgment as he carried her away. She knew that by morning, voices would rise louder, plans would form, and men would saddle their horses. They would not let such an act slip into memory. Pride was more valuable to them than truth. It was not about her being stolen or saved. It was about the insult of being defied. She pictured the sheriff's sharp eyes, the trader's anger, the whispers already spreading through the saloon. By dawn, they would ride not just for her, but for their honor. The giant seemed to sense the storm forming, even in the distance. His eyes shifted from the fire to the dark tree line, listening to sounds she could not hear. His life had been built on survival, on knowing when danger moved before it showed its face. He had been sold for his size, fought for his freedom, and wandered long enough to know that men rarely forgave what bruised their pride. Yet this time, he had chosen not to walk alone. This time, he carried with him someone whose fate had been bound to rejection, much like his own. That choice was a risk greater than any he had faced before. When she asked if he feared the townsfolk would come after them, he only answered that fear was not the right word. He spoke of men who raised guns with shaky hands, who mistook cruelty for courage. He had seen them before, and he knew how far they were willing to go when they felt the world slipping beyond their control. His voice was calm, but beneath it there was tension, like a bowstring pulled tight. He told her they would be hunted, not because she mattered to them, but because he had exposed their weakness. As the fire dimmed, her mind turned restless. She thought of her parents back in town, of how her mother's eyes had watered when the auctioneer failed to find a buyer, of how her father had clenched his jaw to keep from showing his shame. What would they think now, with her gone in the arms of a man the town feared? Would they mourn? Or would they find relief that she was no longer their burden? The thought struck her deep, stirring a mixture of sorrow and anger. She had never asked to be too tall, too strong, too much. Yet in that town, every inch of her had been turned into something to hide. The giant broke her thoughts with a question that startled her. He asked if she wanted to return. His words were simple, but his tone carried something heavier. It was not a challenge, but a choice. For the first time since he had carried her away, she realized he was not holding her against her will. He had given her space to walk away if she wished, though she knew the path back to town was more dangerous than staying by his side. She could not answer right away. Instead, she stared at him, wondering why a man who had lived through so much would risk himself for someone like her. Far away, in the lamplight of the saloon, the trader argued louder. His pride would not let the matter rest. He claimed the girl had been stolen, that the Apache had insulted every man in town by taking her without bargain or consent. He called for a posse, insisting that if they let him vanish into the snow, no one would ever respect their law again. Some men nodded, their faces grim, while others shifted uneasily, remembering the size of the man who had defied them. The sheriff finally rose, his voice cutting through the noise, saying they would ride at first light. His words carried the weight of command, but not conviction. Deep down, he knew what they faced was more than flesh and bone. Back in the clearing, the girl pressed him for answers. She wanted to know why he had said she was perfect for his arms, why he had spoken words that seemed to see her in a way no one else ever had. He told her that the world was cruel to those who did not fit its mold, that strength in the wrong shape was treated as weakness, and beauty outside the narrow walls of custom was called burden. He said he had lived long enough to know that the world feared what it could not measure, and she was proof of that fear. To him, she was not too much. She was a reflection of what the world had tried to break in him. His words shook her. She wanted to believe them, yet doubt clung stubbornly. Could she truly be something more than the town's castaway? Could she be more than a girl who had stood on the block, unsold and unwanted? The fire crackled low, and the night pressed closer. But she could not quiet the storm in her heart. As dawn crept nearer, The wind carried faint sounds from far off, the crunch of hooves on snow, the low murmur of men. The Apache lifted his head, his senses sharpening. He knew the hunters were stirring, that the town's pride had given them no rest. He told her quietly to be ready, though he did not yet say for what. She glanced at him, fear rising, but there was also a strange steadiness building inside her. For once, she was not alone in facing their judgment. The journey that followed was marked by silence and unease. They moved deeper into the wilderness, the giant guiding them through paths hidden by snow and shadow. He seemed to know every curve of the land, every sound of the forest. She followed, her steps heavy but determined. Yet even as she walked, questions gnawed at her. Why had fate placed her in his arms? Why did his presence feel like both protection and danger? The posse from town grew restless as they rode, their voices rising in argument. Some feared they would never catch him. Others burned for confrontation. The trader fueled their anger, his pride twisting into obsession. He painted the Apache as a thief, a savage, a beast that had stolen from them all. But the sheriff rode in silence, his mind troubled. He could not shake the memory of the way the giant had looked at the crowd, unflinching, as if daring them to decide. It was not the gaze of a thief. It was the gaze of a man who had carried burdens they could not comprehend. In the wilderness, the girl felt the weight of choice pressing closer. She could sense that the moment was coming when her path would split her, turn to the life of shame she had always known, or step into the unknown with the man whose presence stirred both fear and hope. The fire within her flickered, uncertain, but not yet gone. The night deepened again, and as they made camp once more, the giant watched her carefully. He did not push, did not demand, but his silence spoke of questions unasked. She sat across from him, staring at the flames, her heart caught between two worlds. The tension wrapped around them like the cold, growing tighter with each passing hour. She knew the town would not stop until they found her, and she knew the giant would not yield easily. Somewhere between the snow and the fire, between fear and hope, their fates tangled deeper, and the storm that had begun in whispers was only just beginning to roar. The cold air cut sharper as the days wore on, the snow deeper, the sky heavier with clouds that threatened to break at any moment. The giant Apache moved steadily through the wilderness, his stride long and unshaken, though the weight of pursuit pressed closer each night. The girl followed him, sometimes walking at his side, sometimes carried when the ground grew too rough. She could see in his silence that he was listening for signs of the men who would not let them vanish quietly. Each crack of a branch, each echo of distant hooves, made the tension stretch tighter. She felt it too. The knowledge that somewhere behind them, men from the town were riding with purpose, their anger stoked by pride. They would not forgive being defied, nor forget the sight of her lifted into arms that dared to challenge their rules. Each step away from the town was a step deeper into conflict, and though she feared it, part of her knew there was no path back. The giant had changed something the moment he claimed her in front of them all. That change could not be undone. At night, the firelight painted the wilderness in shifting shadows. She would sit across from him, her thoughts restless, watching the way his scars caught the glow. She had begun to wonder more about his past, what chains had bound him, what wars had marked his flesh, what betrayals had hardened his eyes. She longed to ask, yet each time she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat. He was a man carved by struggle, and she feared that pressing too hard would break whatever fragile trust he had offered. But she also felt something else, something she could not name. Stirring within her whenever his gaze lingered on her, the pursuit from the town grew fiercer. The posse had split at one point, some pushing forward, others lagging behind, arguing about the worth of chasing through wilderness that seemed endless. But the trader urged them on, his anger now obsession. He painted the Apache as a beast that would bring ruin if left free, telling stories of savagery that grew with each telling. His voice made the weaker men bolder, filling them with the courage of numbers rather than truth. The sheriff, though quiet, rode with them still. His silence gave no comfort, his eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing there would be no easy end to this chase. One night, as snow fell in thick sheets, the girl and the giant took shelter in a hollow near the base of a cliff. The fire sputtered in the wind, and she finally asked him what he feared most. His answer came slow, heavy as stone. He said he feared not death, for he had seen it too many times, but losing the freedom he had fought for. He feared chains more than bullets, silence more than wounds. And then he looked at her, and added that he feared she would not see herself the way he did, that the voices of those who mocked her would weigh heavier than his words. She did not know what to say. His honesty pressed deep into her chest. Leaving her with questions, she dared not answer aloud. In the morning, they pressed on. The forest thinned, and the land opened into wide plains where the snow swept across like waves. Out there would be no hiding, no cover from those who hunted them. She felt exposed, every step echoing like a drumbeat that would draw the posse closer. The giant walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the horizon, every muscle tense. She could sense that he knew the end was nearing, that the collision between them and the townsmen could no longer be. Delayed, the posse finally caught sight of their tracks. Shouts carried across the snow, excitement mingling with anger. The traitor rode hardest at the front, spurring his horse as though he alone could deliver justice. The sheriff followed slower, his hand never far from his gun, but his face heavy with something the others did not share. He was not riding for revenge, nor for pride. He was riding because he knew that if they did not meet the Apache soon, the stories would outgrow the truth, and fear would twist into something worse. The girl felt the storm building. Each night as they camped, she could hear the distant calls carried on the wind. Each morning the giant's silence grew heavier, his movements sharper, as though he was preparing for a moment he had long expected. She found herself caught between terror and resolve. She no longer wished to return, no longer wished to be the girl mocked for her size, left unwanted in her own home. Yet she also knew that standing beside him meant standing against men who had built their world on rules that did not bend. The suspense grew unbearable when, one evening, they came upon a river frozen over with sheets of ice. The giant tested it with his weight, his steps sure but cautious. He carried her across when the ice groaned, his arms steady, even as the world beneath threatened to crack. She clung to him, her breath caught, realizing that the danger of the wild was as merciless as the men who chased them. When they reached the far bank, she turned back and saw faint figures on the other side, their silhouettes dark against the snow. They were closer than ever. The following days blurred into a march of exhaustion and fear. She began to notice how the giant's steps slowed when he thought she wasn't looking, how the cold pressed harder against him than he let on. His strength was immense, but even he was not unbreakable. The thought of him falling, of his arms no longer able to carry her, filled her with dread she had never known before. She began to gather wood for the fire, to watch the horizon when he rested, to take steps of her own rather than be carried. For the first time, she felt not like a burden, but a part of the fight. The climax loomed nearer when they reached a ridge that overlooked a valley below. Smoke curled faintly in the distant, signs of campfires not their own. The giant crouched, his eyes narrowing, listening. She followed his gaze, her stomach twisting as she realized what he already knew. The posse was no longer behind them. They were ahead, waiting. The trap had been set. Her heart pounded as she turned to him, searching his face for answers. He stood tall against the wind, his chest rising with steady breaths, his jaw set with determination. He did not flinch, though she could see the storm raging behind his eyes. He had lived his life fighting against walls that closed in, and now here they were again. But this time she stood with him. The night before they would meet the posse, the fire burned brighter than usual, as if it too sensed the end drawing near. The girl could not sleep. She watched him across the flames, his scars glowing like lines of history etched into his skin. She thought of the words he had spoken, of the strength he saw in her, of the choice that lay before them. She wanted to ask if he believed they could survive, if he believed the world would ever let them walk free. But she stayed silent, for she feared the answer. The wind carried the sounds of movement from the valley below horses, its voices, the clinking of weapons. The posse had settled in, waiting for the dawn. The traitor's voice rang loudest, carrying through the night like a promise of vengeance. The sheriff's quieter tone followed, measured and cautious, but firm. They would not leave until the Apache was brought down. the fire or another. As the fire died down, the giant rose slowly, his silhouette towering against the pale glow of the moon. He looked at her, his eyes steady, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still. She realized then that the hours ahead would decide not only their fate, but the story others would tell of them for years to come. Whether they were remembered as defiance or tragedy, as strength or folly, was yet to be written. The valley waited below, the posse armed and ready, the night cold and sharp. Suspense hung thick in the air, every heartbeat louder than the wind. The giant stood unshaken, the girl by his side, and as dawn's first light touched the horizon, the moment they had both been walking toward at last drew near. The storm of conflict was about to break, and there was no turning back.